In the spring of 1857, a meticulously detail-oriented cotton broker from Charleston named William Thorne was conducting a routine review of accounting ledgers at a Middle Georgia estate known as Moss Creek. As he paged through the records, a deeply anomalous pattern began to emerge, one that would sow a seed of disquiet in his mind for the remainder of his life. Over a span of 15 years, the plantation had sold 23 enslaved men. Each of these individuals had commanded a sale price astonishingly higher than the prevailing market rate. Beside each transaction, a small, consistent marginal notation was inscribed, "Prime Condition Certified." Unbeknownst to Thorne, these two seemingly innocuous words served as a cryptic veneer for a secret of such profound and disturbing nature that its eventual uncovering would threaten to dismantle the meticulously crafted public facades upon which the reputations of Georgia's most influential dynasties were built. For generations, the local power structures had engaged in the systematic suppression of inconvenient truths, employing methods such as the destruction of official documents, the intimidation of potential informants, and the coercion of witnesses into silence. However, certain secrets possess a stubborn resilience against being interred forever, particularly when they are inscribed not in ink, but in blood, and are methodically documented by a woman who possessed the acute understanding that the most devastating weapon available to her was not physical violence, but the unassailable power of factual truth. Before delving deeper into the chronicle of Eleanor Creswell and the plantation that evolved into a graveyard for both human bodies and public reputations, consider this: if you are listening from Georgia or any other southern state, we invite you to leave a comment stating your city or state. If this introductory account has already provoked a visceral reaction, a chill along your spine, then we urge you to subscribe, for the full narrative you are about to encounter will fundamentally challenge every preconceived notion you hold about the antebellum South. What the Charleston broker inadvertently witnessed that afternoon was merely the visible, superficial layer of an operation far more calculated and profound, a scheme that had been functioning with ruthless efficiency since 1841. Moss Creek Plantation was a holding of 370 acres of dense Georgia clay, situated between the Oconee River and the primary county road linking Milledgeville to Augusta. It was not one of the grandiose, opulent estates that typically characterized Southern aristocracy. There was no mansion adorned with white columns, no expansive, manicured gardens, and no renowned history of hosting lavish social gatherings. Instead, Moss Creek had earned a reputation for its stark, unemotional efficiency. The central residence was a simple, two-story structure fashioned from local timber, designed for practicality rather than architectural impression, surrounded by a cluster of 12 slave cabins, a cotton gin, a smokehouse, and a barn that nearby residents often remarked seemed disproportionately large for an operation of its scale. Eleanor Creswell had assumed ownership of Moss Creek in 1840 following the sudden and unexpected death of her husband, Thomas, which a physician had officially attributed to apoplexy. At the age of 31, and according to all public records, childless, societal expectation dictated that she would sell the property and return to the urban comforts of Savannah, where her family operated a respectable shipping enterprise. Defying all convention, Eleanor dismissed the overseer her late husband had employed and personally took command of the plantation's management. Within a single year, she had orchestrated a remarkable transformation, turning Moss Creek from a struggling agricultural concern into one of the most financially successful mid-sized plantations in the entire county. She achieved this feat through a strategy she clinically referred to as strategic acquisition and disposal. While other plantation owners typically maintained multi-generational, familial communities of enslaved people who worked the same land as their forebears, Eleanor approached her workforce as a carefully curated investment portfolio. Her method involved purchasing young, male slaves at market, maintaining them on the plantation for a period of 12 to 18 months, and subsequently selling them for a substantial profit to planters located in the expanding cotton frontiers of Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. The female population at Moss Creek, never exceeding 6 or 7 individuals at any given time, remained on the property permanently. These women, who were consistently older and post-childbearing age, were deliberately selected for their inability to reproduce. Eleanor had absolutely no interest in the complications and resource allocation required for raising enslaved children or managing family units. Her objectives were singular: operational efficiency, financial profit, and the pursuit of another, far more clandestine goal, an objective her neighbors would not begin to comprehend until it was far too late. By 1845, Eleanor had firmly established her reputation as an uncommonly shrewd and capable businesswoman. Male planters who initially refused to engage in negotiations with a woman found themselves reluctantly impressed by her deep expertise in cotton cultivation yields, soil management techniques, and fluctuating market prices. She deliberately abstained from social functions, never attended church services, and completely avoided the intricate rituals that defined the societal role of a Southern lady. When confronted about behavior considered unbecoming of a woman, she would offer a tight, calculated smile that never reached her eyes, and state that the state of widowhood had emancipated her from the tedious burden of social pretense. What her community was entirely unaware of, what they could not possibly have suspected, was that Eleanor Creswell maintained 3 distinct and separate sets of accounting books. The first was a standard ledger of plantation accounts, detailing expenses, crop yields, and sales, which was available for review by any neighbor or tax assessor. The second set recorded the genuine, much higher profits generated by Moss Creek. The third, and most secretive, set of records was kept within a locked iron box concealed beneath the floorboards of her private bedroom, written in a complex code she had developed herself, a cipher based on the shipping manifest she had learned from her father's business in Savannah. Within those encrypted pages, Eleanor documented everything. She recorded names, dates, detailed physical descriptions, and, most critically, observations that would appear meaningless to a casual reader, but were everything to someone who comprehended the nature of her project. Alongside each name, she noted specific characteristics: eye color, hair texture, the distinctive shape of a nose, the particular set of a jawline, variations in skin tone under different lighting conditions. She was, in effect, creating a genealogical catalogue, a comprehensive record designed to become incontrovertible evidence when the moment arrived to level her accusations. The established routine at Moss Creek never varied. Whenever Eleanor purchased a new slave, always male, always between the ages of 18 and 25, always physically robust and healthy, she would isolate him from the rest of the enslaved population for his initial week. The other slaves understood the implication of this segregation, though they never spoke of it openly, even amongst themselves. Some truths were too perilous to give voice to, even in hushed whispers. On the 7th night, Eleanor would summon the young man to the main house. The events that transpired during those nocturnal hours remained behind locked doors, but the enslaved individuals who worked within the house observed certain consistent rituals. They noted that Eleanor always bathed beforehand, that she wore a specific, plain grey cotton dress devoid of any decoration, and that a lamp burned in her bedroom until well past midnight. They also observed that the young men who emerged the following morning were fundamentally altered. They walked with a different gait, their eyes permanently cast downward, their shoulders curved inward as if attempting to physically diminish their presence. And they noticed that Eleanor would subsequently spend hours in her study the next day, the iron box open beside her, writing in her private ledger with the intense concentration of a court clerk recording vital legal testimony. The first disappearance occurred in the autumn of 1843, though it would be years before any connection to Moss Creek was established. A slave named Samuel, sold to a cotton planter in Alabama for the remarkable sum of $1,800, never arrived at his designated destination. The irate buyer dispatched a letter to Eleanor demanding either the delivery of the enslaved man or a full refund. Eleanor responded by providing copies of the bill of sale, a signed receipt from the driver responsible for Samuel's transport, and a politely worded expression of concern. The matter was subsequently dropped. The prevailing assumption was that Samuel had seized an opportunity to escape during the journey westward. It was common knowledge that slaves frequently attempted to flee. 6 months later, another man sold by Eleanor, named Isaac, purchased by a planter in Mississippi, similarly vanished between Georgia and his final destination. Once again, Eleanor produced impeccable documentation. Once again, the purchaser grudgingly accepted the financial loss. The statistical probability of 2 slaves from the same small plantation successfully escaping seemed low, but was not considered impossible. By 1847, the number of men sold by Moss Creek who had disappeared without any trace had risen to 5. This pattern should have triggered alarm, yet it failed to do so. The buyers were geographically dispersed across 3 different states, communication between planters was often sporadic and unreliable, and Eleanor's reputation for conducting business with scrupulous honesty remained untarnished. She invariably provided comprehensive documentation, consistently expressed the appropriate level of concern, and always suggested that the men had likely fled at the first available opportunity. Within a system fundamentally constructed on the premise that enslaved people were constantly seeking freedom, her explanation was not merely believable, it was expected. The horrifying reality, unknown to anyone at the time, was that none of these men had ever left the state of Georgia. Their bodies were interred in unmarked graves on the land of Moss Creek itself, buried in a specific, rocky section of the property that was unsuitable for cotton cultivation. Eleanor had instructed her field hands never to plow this area, claiming she intended to plant an orchard there someday. That orchard never materialized, but the section of land remained undisturbed, gradually filling with the deceased. The killings followed a pattern as methodical and precise as every other aspect of Eleanor's existence. After completing her ritual with each young man and recording her observations in the coded ledger, she would enter a period of waiting. She would ensure the man was treated well during his remaining months at Moss Creek, guaranteeing he gained weight and muscle mass to increase his market value. She would arrange for a doctor to examine him, who would then provide a certification attesting to his prime physical condition. She would then orchestrate the sale, always to a buyer located at least 300 miles away, and always conducted through intermediaries who managed the transportation logistics. Then, precisely 3 days before the scheduled departure, she would summon the man to the barn after dark, the same barn neighbors had noted for its unusual size. Within this barn, accessible only through a locked door, was a small room. In that room, she would offer him a drink of whiskey, presenting it as a rare treat before the arduous journey ahead. The whiskey was invariably laced with laudanum, a sufficient dose to induce drowsiness but not complete unconsciousness. She required him to remain aware for what was to follow. She needed him to comprehend. Eleanor would present the ledger to him, explaining in calm, measured tones exactly what she had documented. She would delineate the physical characteristics she had noted, the features that matched men he had never met, men whose names held no meaning for him. Then, she would elucidate her intention to utilize this information to destroy powerful families, to expose profound societal hypocrisy, and to dismantle the very structure of Southern society. She would observe his face as the dawning realization of his role in her scheme took hold, as he understood he had been selected not for his labor capacity, but because he possessed specific physical features Eleanor had been searching for, features that rendered him valuable not as a worker, but as evidence. Then, as the laudanum pulled him deeper into a stupor, she would summon the only other individual at Moss Creek who was privy to the full extent of her designs, the only person she trusted with her secrets, the only person who shared her profound hatred for the system that had created places like Moss Creek. Her son would then emerge from the shadows of the barn, and together, they would complete the work they had initiated years earlier. Henry Creswell was a person who, according to all official public records, census documents, and church registries, was not supposed to exist. It was a matter of public record that Eleanor and Thomas Creswell had remained childless throughout their 12-year marriage. This was technically true. What the records did not show was that Eleanor had given birth to a son in 1829, 7 years prior to her marriage, when she was a 20-year-old unmarried woman, a scandal that would have irrevocably destroyed her family's standing within Savannah's tight-knit merchant society. The father was a man her own father would never have accepted and could never publicly acknowledge. The infant was sent north before his first birthday, placed in the care of Eleanor's maternal aunt in Philadelphia, a widow who agreed to raise the boy as her own adopted son. Eleanor visited once a year, always during the winter when travel between Georgia and Pennsylvania could be plausibly explained as a family obligation. Henry grew up knowing the identity of his biological mother, but understanding he could never publicly claim her, never refer to her as anything other than Aunt Eleanor in the presence of others. He also grew up knowing the identity of his father, an enslaved man who worked on the Savannah docks, loading ships for Eleanor's father. A man whose intelligence and quiet dignity had attracted the young Eleanor's attention during a summer of personal rebellion and parental distraction. A man who had been sold away the moment her pregnancy could no longer be concealed. He was sold to a sugar plantation in Louisiana, where the life expectancy for field hands was measured in years, not decades. Eleanor never saw him again. She later learned, through careful inquiry, that he had died in 1835, essentially worked to death in the cane fields, his body discarded in an unmarked grave like refuse. This knowledge catalyzed a transformation within her, crystallizing her grief and rage into something colder, more calculated, and infinitely more dangerous, a long-term plan that would require decades to execute but was designed to annihilate everything the men who had destroyed her life held sacred. Henry returned to Georgia in 1841, 1 year after Thomas Creswell's death. He arrived not as Eleanor's son, but under the identity of Henry Lell, a traveling merchant specializing in farm equipment, a respectable businessman from Philadelphia with legitimate credentials and an excellent reputation. He resided at boarding houses in Milledgeville and Augusta, conducted regular business trips throughout Middle Georgia, and occasionally visited Moss Creek to discuss equipment purchases with the efficient widow Creswell. No one suspected that these visits sometimes extended for days, that Henry maintained his own private room in the main house, or that he and Eleanor spent long evenings reviewing the coded ledger and strategizing their subsequent moves. No one suspected that the unusually large barn contained not only a locked room, but also a hidden cellar accessible through a trapdoor concealed beneath the hay, a cellar where specific implements were stored and where tasks requiring absolute privacy were carried out. Eleanor's selection process for her victims was exceptionally meticulous. She did not choose randomly. Each man she purchased had been the subject of careful prior research. She would visit slave markets in Savannah, Augusta, and Milledgeville, examining young male slaves with the discerning eye of a horse breeder evaluating bloodlines. However, she was not assessing teeth or muscle tone, she was scrutinizing facial features. She had dedicated years to compiling information on Georgia's most prominent families, studying their histories, genealogies, and, most importantly, identifying their darkest secrets. She knew which planters had fathered children with enslaved women, which families had carefully concealed mixed-race branches, and which men maintained discreet secondary households with enslaved mistresses. She acquired this knowledge because wealthy men were rarely discreet in their indiscretions, because enslaved people who worked in great houses communicated among themselves, and because information flowed through clandestine networks that white society never imagined existed. When Eleanor identified a young enslaved man whose physical features, a distinctive Rutledge nose, a Pemberton jawline, the unusual gray-green eyes characteristic of the Caldwell bloodline, matched those of a prominent family, she would purchase him irrespective of cost. She would bring him to Moss Creek, complete her ritual, and record every minute detail that could potentially serve as proof of paternity. Her coded ledger became a repository of evidence that she believed would, when revealed, force proud families to confront the truths they had spent generations vehemently denying, evidence that would expose the fundamental hypocrisy at the core of a system that legally defined humanity by race, while those who enforced that system routinely transgressed the very boundaries they claimed were sacred and inviolable. The men she selected became living proof of this hypocrisy. And then, because living proof could be questioned, could deny the truth, could be relocated beyond her reach, they were transformed into dead proof. They became bodies that could be exhumed if necessary, bones that could be measured and analyzed, evidence that could not lie, flee, or refuse to testify. By 1850, 13 men lay buried in the uncultivated section of Moss Creek. 13 sets of physical measurements were recorded in Eleanor's coded ledger. 13 prominent families were effectively marked for destruction, awaiting the moment Eleanor decided the time was right to reveal her evidence. However, the broader national context was beginning to shift. The country was undergoing profound changes, with escalating tensions between the North and South over the issue of slavery. The Compromise of 1850 had provided a temporary, fragile peace regarding slavery's expansion into new territories, but a pervasive sense of impending, larger confrontation loomed. Eleanor began to contemplate whether her meticulously constructed plan would ever reach its intended culmination, or if the war that seemed increasingly inevitable would destroy not only the South but also her capacity to ensure her accusations were heard. Then, in the summer of 1856, an unforeseen development presented itself, one that would compel Eleanor to accelerate her timeline and assume risks she had never originally intended. A letter arrived at Moss Creek from Boston. It was addressed to the widow Creswell and signed by a man identifying himself as Daniel Harrington, a lawyer and correspondent for the prominent abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator. Harrington stated that, through unspecified sources, he had become aware of certain irregularities at her plantation. He had questions regarding her business practices, the unusually high turnover within her workforce, and the men who had mysteriously disappeared after being sold. He announced his intention to travel through Georgia in September and expressed his hope to call upon her to discuss these matters. Eleanor read the letter 3 times, her hands perfectly steady, her expression revealing nothing. She then summoned Henry, who was visiting that week, and presented him with the message. "Someone has been talking," she stated quietly. "Someone possesses knowledge they should not." Henry studied the letter, his face, which so closely resembled his father's, according to Eleanor's memories, drawn with concern. "Do we cease operations?" he asked. "Do we become quiet until he loses interest?" Eleanor offered a tight smile, the kind that never reached her eyes. "No," she replied. "We will invite him to visit. We will show him precisely what he expects to see, a successful plantation managed by a competent widow. And then we will determine who sent him and the true extent of his knowledge." What Eleanor did not yet realize was that Daniel Harrington's letter was not the inception of her troubles, but rather a harbinger of something far more perilous, a convergence of circumstances that would force all of her secrets into the light far sooner than she had ever planned.